I'm taking my mistress instead. I sold our house before they returned. In the morning, my husband texted me, "Don't go to the airport. I'm taking my secretary to the Maldives instead. She deserves this vacation more than you." The next day, I called a realtor, sold our penthouse for cash, and left the country. When they came back bronzed and happy, the house. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." I was folding Richard's shirts when my phone buzzed on the mahogany dresser. The morning light filtered through our cream silk curtains, casting that golden glow across our master bedroom that I'd always loved. 25 years of marriage, and I still took pride in keeping everything perfect for him. The shirts were crisp white cotton, still warm from the iron, and I was arranging them in his suitcase with the same care I'd shown for every business trip, every vacation, every detail of our life together. We were supposed to leave for the Maldives in 3 hours. Our second honeymoon, Richard had called it. After months of him working late, coming home exhausted and distant, I thought this trip might restore something between us. I'd spent weeks planning every detail, researching the resort, packing his favorite cologne, even buying new lingerie that made me feel foolish at 55, but hopeful nonetheless. The phone buzzed again. Richard's name appeared on the screen, and my heart did that little skip it still did after all these years. Even now, even when things felt strained between us, I loved him. I swiped to open the message, expecting maybe a reminder about our departure time or a sweet note about our upcoming getaway. Instead, I read words that shattered my world in an instant. "Don't go to the airport. I'm taking Jessica to the Maldives instead. She deserves this vacation more than you." I read it once, twice, 3 times. The words didn't change. They sat there on my screen, cold and clinical, as if he were canceling a dinner reservation instead of destroying our marriage. Jessica, his secretary, the 29-year-old with the bright smile and ambitious eyes who'd started working at his firm 6 months ago. My legs gave out. I sank onto our bed, still holding his perfectly folded shirt in my hands. The phone slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the hardwood floor, but I barely heard it. All I could hear was the rushing of blood in my ears, the sound of my heart breaking so loudly it seemed to echo off the walls. "Jessica deserves this vacation more than you." Those words played on repeat in my mind. More than me. The woman who'd supported his career for 25 years, who'd given up my own dreams of architecture to become the perfect corporate wife. The woman who'd organized countless dinner parties for his colleagues, who'd smiled and nodded through years of his subtle criticisms, who'd made his life so smooth and effortless that he'd forgotten I was even there. I looked around our bedroom, really looked at it for the first time in years. Everything was exactly as I'd arranged it. The antique vanity where I sat every morning, applying makeup to hide the exhaustion from staying up late managing our household. The walk-in closet where my clothes hung in perfect order, organized by color and season, while Richard's side looked like a hurricane had hit it because he knew I'd clean it up. The framed photos on my nightstand showed a timeline of our marriage, our wedding day, when I was 30 and believed in fairy tales. Richard at 32, devastatingly handsome in his tuxedo, promising to love and cherish me forever. Photos from various anniversaries, business functions, vacations where I'd always stood slightly behind him, smiling supportively while he commanded attention. In every single photo, I looked smaller. Not just physically, but somehow diminished. When had I become so invisible that my own husband could discard me like yesterday's newspaper? I picked up my phone with shaking hands. Part of me wanted to call him, to beg, to ask what I'd done wrong. But I already knew what he'd say, that I'd let myself go, that I wasn't exciting anymore, that Jessica was young and fresh and everything I wasn't. He'd probably been planning this for weeks, maybe months, while I'd been excitedly planning our romantic getaway. The humiliation burned in my chest like acid. How long had he been with her? How many times had he come home from late meetings with her perfume on his clothes while I waited dinner for him, worried he was working too hard? How many times had they laughed about the clueless wife at home, folding his shirts and planning vacations she'd never take? I stood up slowly, my legs still unsteady. The suitcase lay open on our bed, half packed with clothes for a trip that would never happen. At least not with me. I imagined Jessica in the resort restaurant where I'd made dinner reservations, wearing the flowing dresses I'd never have the courage to buy anymore. I imagined Richard's hands on her skin, the same hands that used to touch me like I was precious before I became just another piece of furniture in his perfectly arranged life. The worst part wasn't even the affair, it was the casual cruelty of that text message. He could have called. He could have had the decency to lie, to make up some emergency. Instead, he'd reduced 25 years of marriage to a text message that read like a business memo. Cold, efficient, final. I walked to my vanity and stared at my reflection. 55 years old, well-maintained but not young. Elegant but not exciting. I'd spent so many years trying to be the woman Richard wanted me to be that I'd forgotten who I actually was underneath all the careful grooming and people-pleasing. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Richard. "Tell the housekeeper not to come this week. We'll be gone until Sunday." Like he and Jessica were already a we in his mind. I wasn't even worth a proper explanation or apology. Just instructions about the housekeeper, as if I were his personal assistant instead of his wife. Something cold and hard settled in my chest, replacing the shock and hurt. For 25 years, I'd been the perfect wife. I'd sacrificed my career, my independence, my dreams, all to support his ambitions. I'd made his life so comfortable that he'd taken me completely for granted. I'd been so focused on being worthy of his love that I'd never stopped to question whether he was worthy of mine. I walked to my jewelry box and opened the hidden compartment where I kept my mother's pearls, the ones Richard had always said were too old-fashioned for me to wear. Hidden beneath them was something else Richard knew nothing about. A bank statement showing an account in my name only, with a balance that would have shocked him. $800,000, inherited from my father 5 years ago, and carefully invested without Richard's knowledge. He'd always handled our finances, doling out credit cards and an allowance like I was his dependent rather than his partner. He had no idea that I'd maintained my own resources, my own small rebellion against his control. I'd told myself it was just insurance, just security. I'd never imagined I'd actually need it. But I needed it now. I looked one more time at the packed suitcase, at the clothes I'd chosen so carefully for our romantic getaway. Then I unpacked every single item and put them back where they belonged. If Richard wanted Jessica to have what was mine, he was about to learn that I had a few surprises of my own. The girl he'd chosen over me might be younger and prettier, but she was about to discover that she'd won a prize that came with nothing attached, and Richard was about to learn the difference between a wife and a doormat. I picked up my phone and deleted his messages without responding. Let him wonder. Let them both wonder what I was thinking, what I was planning. They'd find out soon enough. The morning light was still streaming through those cream curtains, but everything had changed. I was no longer the woman who'd been folding shirts an hour ago, dreaming of romantic dinners and moonlit walks on the beach. That woman was gone, and in her place was someone I'd forgotten existed, someone who was done being taken for granted. I sat in the kitchen, staring at my untouched coffee as the morning turned to afternoon. The silence in our house felt different now, heavy with the weight of 25 years of self-deception. Every corner of this place held memories I'd painted in golden hues, but now I saw them for what they really were. This kitchen had been my domain, where I'd created thousands of meals Richard barely noticed. The marble countertops I'd chosen so carefully, thinking he'd appreciate my taste. The commercial-grade appliances I'd requested, dreaming of cooking elaborate dinners for his colleagues, everything designed to make me the perfect hostess for his career advancement. I remembered the early years, when I still had my architecture firm. I'd come home energized from designing office buildings and residential complexes, eager to share my day with Richard. But his work was always more important, more demanding, more deserving of discussion. Gradually, my stories became shorter, then disappeared altogether. It was easier to listen to him talk about his cases, his clients, his triumphs. The transition happened so slowly I barely noticed it. First, it was missing one client meeting because Richard needed me at a firm dinner. Then, it was postponing a project deadline because he was stressed and needed my attention. Within 2 years of marriage, I'd restructured my entire business around his schedule. Within 5 years, I'd sold it entirely. "You don't need that stress," he'd said, stroking my hair as I cried over the contracts I was giving up. "I make enough for both of us. Focus on making our home beautiful, on supporting my career. That's more important than any building you could design." I'd believed him. I'd actually felt grateful that he wanted to take care of me financially. What I hadn't realized was that he wasn't offering to support me. He was systematically removing my independence. Every client I turned away, every project I declined, every year that passed without my name on a building's cornerstone made me smaller in his eyes. The irony was crushing now. While I was giving up my career to support his, Richard was building his reputation on the foundation of my stability. He could work late, travel at a moment's notice, take on high-profile cases because he knew I'd handle everything else. The house, the social calendar, the 1,000 details that made his life seamless. I walked to his home office, a room I rarely entered without invitation. The leather chairs smelled like his expensive cologne and the whiskey he drank when reviewing cases. His desk was covered with legal briefs and contracts, but what caught my attention was his computer screen, still open to his email. I shouldn't have looked, but I did. The emails between Richard and Jessica went back months. Not just work correspondence, but increasingly personal messages that made my stomach turn. It started professionally enough, but gradually became flirtatious, then intimate. Reading their exchanges was like watching my marriage die in real time. "Working late again tonight. Margaret won't even notice. She's usually asleep by 10 anyway. Can't wait to take you somewhere beautiful. You deserve to see the world, not just this boring office. She's not like you, Jess. She's become so. Predictable, domestic. You make me feel alive again." Each message was a knife twist, but the pattern that emerged was even more devastating than the affair itself. Richard had been systematically devaluing me in his own mind, creating a narrative where I was the problem. I wasn't exciting enough, passionate enough, young enough. I'd become a burden he was graciously bearing instead of the partner who'd made his success possible. I scrolled further back, to emails from years ago. Other women's names appeared. Not Jessica, but Sarah, a paralegal. Before her, Amanda from accounting. The details were different, but the pattern was identical. Richard discarding each woman when the novelty wore off, when they started wanting more than secret meetings and hidden affection. My hands were shaking as I closed the laptop. This wasn't just about Jessica. This was about who Richard really was, who he'd always been. I'd spent 25 years believing I'd somehow failed him, that I needed to be more interesting, more attractive, more worthy of his love. But the truth was simpler and more devastating. Richard was incapable of loving anyone more than he loved the excitement of conquest. I walked upstairs to our bedroom and opened my jewelry box again. Beneath my mother's pearls was the bank statement, but under that was something else I'd hidden for years. A letter from my father, written just before he died. I'd read it once and never again, because his words had been too painful to face. "My darling Margaret," it began in his careful handwriting, "I worry about you in that marriage. Richard is charming, but charm isn't love. Love doesn't require you to become smaller to make someone else feel bigger. Your mother and I raised you to build things, to create, to take up space in the world. Don't let anyone convince you that you're meant to be invisible." He'd seen what I'd refused to acknowledge, My father, who'd built his construction business from nothing, who'd recognized ambition and drive, had spotted Richard's fundamental selfishness immediately. But I'd been so infatuated with Richard's sophistication, his confidence, his promises of the life we'd build together, that I'd dismissed my father's concerns as old-fashioned protectiveness. My father had left me that money not as an inheritance, but as an escape route. His accompanying note was brief but clear. For when you remember who you really are. Now, sitting in the bedroom where Richard had made me feel like a guest in my own life, I finally understood what my father had seen. Richard hadn't married me because he loved me. He'd married me because I was useful. Young enough to be impressive, ambitious enough to support his career, malleable enough to be shaped into whatever he needed me to be. For 25 years, I'd tried to be worthy of him. I'd exercised religiously to maintain my figure, read his favorite authors to be interesting at dinner parties, learned to play golf because his colleagues' wives played golf. I'd turned myself inside out trying to be enough for a man who was fundamentally incapable of seeing me as enough. The worst part was how I'd participated in my own erasure. When Richard criticized my cooking, I took classes. When he suggested I was getting too comfortable in my appearance, I hired a personal trainer. When he implied that my opinions weren't sophisticated enough for his colleagues, I stopped sharing them. Every criticism had been a chisel, and I'd helped him sculpt away pieces of myself until there was almost nothing left. But not quite nothing. Hidden beneath years of people-pleasing and self-doubt was the woman my father had raised. The woman who'd built a successful architecture firm before I was 30. The woman who'd designed buildings that still stood across the state, even though Richard had convinced me they didn't matter. I walked to the window and looked out at our neighborhood. The other houses, with their perfect lawns and expensive cars, suddenly looked like an elaborate stage set. How many of the wives in those houses were living my life? How many had given up their dreams to support men who saw them as accessories rather than partners? Richard's message echoed in my mind again. She deserves this vacation more than you. The assumption that Jessica's desires mattered more than my feelings. The casual cruelty of replacing me like a broken appliance. The years of conditioning that had convinced me this treatment was normal, even deserved. But something had shifted in me. Maybe it was reading those emails and seeing myself through Richard's dismissive eyes. Maybe it was finding my father's letter and remembering who I'd been before I'd tried to become who Richard wanted. Maybe it was simply reaching the end of my capacity to accept unacceptable treatment. I wasn't going to beg Richard to choose me over Jessica. I wasn't going to fight for a man who'd already decided I was disposable. I wasn't going to waste another moment trying to prove my worth to someone who was fundamentally incapable of seeing it. For the first time in decades, I was going to choose myself. I opened my laptop and began researching something I'd never imagined I'd need to know: how to quickly liquidate assets and disappear. The house, the joint accounts, the life we'd built together. It was all going to change. Richard thought he held all the cards, but he'd forgotten something crucial. My name was on everything that mattered, and I was done being invisible. The documents were spread across my kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle I'd never bothered to solve. Property deeds, insurance papers, bank statements. 25 years of paperwork that Richard had always handled while I focused on being the perfect wife. Now, for the first time, I was reading every single page with the attention I should have given them years ago. What I discovered made my hands tremble. The house, our beautiful colonial with its manicured gardens and impressive facade, was solely in my name. I stared at the deed, reading it 3 times before the reality sank in. During the mortgage application process back in 2003, Richard's credit had been temporarily damaged by a client's defaulted payment. His lawyer had suggested putting the property in my name to secure better terms, with the understanding that we'd transfer it to joint ownership later. We never did. For 20 years, I'd lived in this house believing it was ours, making decisions with Richard about renovations and improvements, while legally it belonged entirely to me. Richard had been so focused on his career, so confident in his control over every aspect of our lives that he'd forgotten this crucial detail. Or perhaps he'd assumed it didn't matter because he'd never imagined I'd have the courage to use that power. I pulled out my phone and called Patricia Wells, the real estate agent who'd helped us find this house 2 decades ago. She was still in business, now running one of the most successful agencies in our area. Her voice was warm when she answered, remembering me immediately. "Margaret, how wonderful to hear from you. How are you and Richard doing?" "Actually, Patricia, I need to ask you something confidential. Hypothetically, if someone needed to sell a house very quickly, say within 48 hours, what would that look like?" There was a pause. Patricia had been in real estate long enough to recognize the tone of a woman whose life was falling apart. "Hypothetically," she said carefully, "it would mean accepting significantly below market value. Are you in some kind of trouble, dear?" "Not trouble," I said, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. "Freedom." I explained the situation in broad strokes, not the affair, but the need for immediate liquidity and complete discretion. Patricia listened without judgment, her professional instincts kicking in. "Your house would normally sell for around $1,200,000, she said. "For a cash sale within 48 hours, you'd probably need to accept $900,000. Maybe $950 if we're lucky. It's a significant loss, but if you need out quickly." $900,000. It seemed like an enormous sum and a devastating loss at the same time. But what was the alternative? Stay married to a man who'd discarded me via text message? Fight for half of assets that I'd helped build while he rewrote history to make me the villain? "Patricia," I said, "I want to list it. Today. Cash offers only." Another pause. "Margaret, are you absolutely certain? Once this process starts, there's no going back. And Richard, does he know?" "The house is in my name only," I said. "I checked the deed twice. Richard's signature isn't required." I could almost hear Patricia's sharp intake of breath. She'd been in real estate long enough to see messy divorces, but this was different. This was a woman taking nuclear action before the war had even been declared. "I'll be there in an hour," she said. "And Margaret? Whatever Richard did, he's an idiot." While I waited for Patricia, I opened my laptop and logged into our joint checking account. Richard had always handled the finances, giving me a credit card and an allowance like I was his teenager daughter rather than his wife. But I'd paid attention over the years, and I knew exactly how much we had and where it was. The checking account held $35,000. Our savings account had another $60,000. There was also a money market account with $40,000 that Richard thought I didn't know about. All of it was in both our names, which meant I had every legal right to access it. I transferred every penny to my private account. It felt like the first truly rebellious thing I'd done in my entire marriage. For 25 years, I'd asked permission for every purchase, justified every expense, lived within the boundaries Richard had set for me. Now I was taking back resources I'd helped earn through my unpaid labor as his personal assistant, housekeeper, social coordinator, and emotional support system. My phone buzzed. Another message from Richard. "Hope you're not sulking. This is good for both of us. You can finally stop pretending you enjoy travel." The casual cruelty of it took my breath away. Not only had he replaced me, but he was rewriting our history to justify it. All those trips where I'd planned every detail, researched restaurants and attractions, packed and unpacked for both of us, now I was the one who'd never enjoyed traveling. All those times I'd bitten my tongue when he'd criticized my choices or dismissed my preferences, now I was the one who'd been pretending. I deleted the message without responding. Let him enjoy his romantic getaway with Jessica. Let them toast their bright future over champagne I'd helped pay for. They'd have plenty of time to celebrate before they realized what was waiting for them at home. Patricia arrived exactly 1 hour later, a whirlwind of efficiency and empathy. She was in her 60s now, her hair silver instead of the blonde I remembered, but her eyes were as sharp as ever. She took one look at me and pulled me into a hug. "Whatever's happening, "You're doing the right thing," she said firmly. "I can see it in your face. You look terrified and determined, which is exactly how a woman should look when she's saving herself." We walked through the house together, Patricia taking photos and making notes while I pointed out the improvements Richard and I had made over the years. The kitchen renovation that had cost $40,000, the master bathroom with its marble shower and soaking tub, the finished basement that Richard used as his man cave, complete with a bar and home theater system. "This is a beautiful home," Patricia said as we finished the tour. "Any couple would be lucky to live here. It's going to break my heart to see it sell for less than it's worth." "It's just a house," I said, and meant it. "I'd rather be free than rich." She squeezed my hand. "I know several investors who buy properties like this for renovation and resale. They pay cash and move fast. Let me make some calls." Within 3 hours, Patricia had 2 serious offers. The first was for $875,000, available for closing within 5 days. The second was for $900,000, with closing scheduled for the next afternoon. I chose the second option without hesitation. "Are you sure you don't want to wait and see if we can get a better offer?" Patricia asked. "I know this feels urgent, but even another day might—" "No," I interrupted. "Tomorrow afternoon. I want this done before they come back from their trip." That evening, I began the process of erasing myself from the life I'd built with Richard. I called our housekeeper, Maria, and told her to take the week off with pay. I couldn't bear the thought of her arriving to find the house empty and wondering what had happened to the family she'd served for 8 years. I went through our photo albums, taking only the pictures of myself before marriage and a few family photos with relatives who were mine, not Richard's. Everything else, our wedding pictures, vacation photos, images of dinner parties and corporate events, I left exactly where they were. Those weren't memories of my life. They were documentation of my performance as Richard's wife. In our walk-in closet, I packed only the clothes that felt like me. Not the conservative suits Richard preferred for corporate events, or the cocktail dresses he'd chosen for firm parties, but the casual clothes I wore when he wasn't around. Jeans and sweaters, comfortable shoes, the flowing skirts and colorful blouses I'd gravitated toward before I'd learned to dress like an extension of his professional image. I found myself standing in front of my vanity, looking at the jewelry Richard had given me over the years. The tennis bracelet for our 10th anniversary, the diamond earrings for my 40th birthday, the necklace he'd surprised me with after his biggest case win. Beautiful pieces, all of them, but they felt like shackles now. Symbols of a transaction rather than gifts of love. I left them all in their velvet boxes. The only jewelry I took was my mother's pearl necklace and the simple gold locket my grandmother had given me when I graduated college. Pieces that belonged to my history, not my performance. The hardest part was writing the note. I must have started it 20 times, trying to find words that would explain 2.5 decades of growing disappointment, the slow erosion of my sense of self, the moment when his casual cruelty had finally shattered my willingness to accept the unacceptable. In the end, I kept it simple. "Richard, I hope you and Jessica enjoy the Maldives. You're right. She probably does deserve that vacation more than I do. By the time you read this, I'll be starting my new life. Don't look for me. There's nothing left to discuss. The house has been sold. All joint accounts have been closed. I've taken only what belongs to me. I hope you find what you're looking for. I finally have. Margaret." I left the note on his pillow, right where he'd left his phone countless nights when he'd come home late from work meetings that I now knew were dates with other women. The closing was scheduled for 2 o'clock the next afternoon. By 3 o'clock tomorrow, I would no longer be Mrs. Richard Henley, suburban wife and professional hostess. I would just be Margaret again, for the first time in 25 years. The woman who was about to emerge from the ashes of this marriage wasn't the broken, submissive creature Richard thought he was abandoning. She was the architect who'd once designed buildings that changed skylines. The woman my father had raised to take up space in the world. And she was done being invisible. The closing took place in a sterile conference room that smelled like coffee and legal documents. I sat at one end of a polished table, facing Mr. and Mrs. Chen, the investors who were buying my house. They were a quiet couple in their 50s, clearly experienced in these types of transactions. They asked no personal questions, offered no sympathy, and treated the purchase like the business transaction it was. Patricia sat beside me, occasionally squeezing my hand when the reality of what I was doing threatened to overwhelm me. Across from us, the buyer's attorney shuffled through paperwork while their accountant verified wire transfer details. Everything was moving with the efficient precision I'd requested, but sitting there felt surreal. 20 years of memories reduced to signatures on legal documents. 20 years of mortgage payments, property taxes, and careful maintenance ending with the scratch of a pen across dotted lines. But with each signature, I felt lighter. Each page that transferred ownership away from me was another chain broken, another piece of Richard's control over my life dissolved. The wire transfer has been confirmed, the buyer's attorney announced at 2:45. $900,000 has been deposited into the account ending in 7439. $900,000. Combined with my inheritance account and the joint funds I'd transferred, I now had access to over $1,700,000. More money than I'd ever imagined having control over, and certainly more than Richard knew I possessed. "Congratulations," Mrs. Chen said as we stood to leave. "I hope your fresh start brings you everything you're looking for." Fresh start. The words felt like a benediction. Patricia drove me back to what had been my house one last time. The new owners wouldn't take possession until Monday, giving me the weekend to finish my preparations. But standing on the front porch, looking at the home where I'd spent my entire adult life, I felt no nostalgia, only relief. "Where will you go?" Patricia asked as we stood in the foyer. The house already felt different, emptied of its power over me. "Tuscany," I said, surprising myself by speaking the dream aloud. "I've always wanted to see the hill towns, maybe rent a villa for a few months while I figure out what comes next." Patricia smiled. "That sounds perfect. And Margaret? When Richard comes home and realizes what you've done, he's going to try everything to track you down. Are you prepared for that?" I was. That morning, I'd met with Thomas Chen, my private banker, to set up offshore accounts and international wire capabilities. I'd applied for expedited passport renewal. I'd researched extended stay visas for Italy. Every detail had been planned with the same meticulous care I'd once devoted to Richard's dinner parties. "He can try," I said. "But I'm not the same woman who was folding his shirts 3 days ago." That evening, I made one final tour of the house, saying goodbye to the life I was leaving behind. In the kitchen where I'd prepared thousands of meals, I left a bottle of Richard's favorite wine with a note attached, "For your celebration." In his office, I placed the financial documents showing the closed accounts where he'd be sure to find them. I wanted him to understand exactly what had happened, and exactly who had done it, but the real message was in my absence itself. Richard had spent 25 years teaching me that I was replaceable, forgettable, unworthy of basic respect. Now he would learn what life looked like when I actually disappeared. I slept that night in a hotel near the airport, my suitcases packed with only the essentials for starting over. The bed felt unfamiliar, but not uncomfortable. For the first time in decades, I wasn't lying awake wondering if Richard was really working late, or if I'd failed him somehow. I wasn't planning his schedule or worrying about his needs or trying to anticipate his moods. I was thinking about myself, about the woman I'd been before marriage, and the woman I might become now that I was free to discover her again. My phone had been buzzing intermittently with calls from numbers I didn't recognize. Richard must have realized something was wrong when I didn't answer his messages from the Maldives. But I'd already changed my number and forwarded my mail to a service that would hold everything until I decided what I wanted to keep from my old life. The next morning, I boarded a flight to Florence with nothing but carry-on luggage and a heart that felt lighter with every mile between me and the life I was leaving behind. As the plane lifted off, I looked down at the Connecticut landscape where I'd spent half my life trying to be someone else's idea of perfect. I'd spent the flight researching properties in Tuscany, virtual touring villas, and apartments online. By the time we landed in Italy, I'd found what I was looking for: a restored farmhouse outside Montalcino, available for a 6-month rental. It had stone walls, a terrace overlooking rolling vineyards, and most importantly, no history of disappointment or compromise. The property manager, a warm woman named Francesca, met me at the villa with keys and a bottle of local wine. The house was even more beautiful than the photos suggested. Afternoon light streamed through tall windows onto terracotta floors. The kitchen was rustic but well-equipped, designed for someone who cooked for pleasure rather than obligation. The master bedroom had French doors that opened onto a private terrace where I could see nothing but olive groves and sky. "Is beautiful, yes?" Francesca asked as we completed the tour. "You will be happy here, I think. The house? She welcomes women who are finding themselves. Finding themselves. As if this process was common enough that the house had developed a specialty. I wondered how many other women had stood on this terrace, looking out at the Tuscan countryside while rebuilding their lives from scratch. That first evening in my new temporary home, I opened the wine Francesca had left and walked out onto the terrace as the sun set behind the hills. The silence was profound, not the tense quiet of a house where conversation had died, but the peaceful stillness of a place where I could finally hear my own thoughts. My phone showed several missed calls from Connecticut numbers, probably lawyers or friends who'd heard about the house sale. But I wasn't ready to explain or justify my choices to anyone yet. This time was mine. This space was mine. This silence was mine. I thought about Richard and Jessica, probably still lounging on their resort beach, maybe discussing their future together. Richard had likely painted me as a bitter, abandoned wife who'd finally shown her true colors. Jessica probably felt victorious, having won the prize she'd worked so hard to steal. Let them have each other. Richard would discover soon enough that a woman who'd pursue a married man was exactly the type who'd leave when the money disappeared. And Jessica would learn that a man who'd discard a 25-year marriage via text message wasn't the romantic hero of her dreams. But their drama was no longer my concern. I was 55 years old, financially independent, and for the first time in my adult life, accountable to no one but myself. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. As darkness fell over the Tuscan hills, I made a list of things I wanted to do with my freedom. Learn Italian, take cooking classes with local chefs, visit every museum in Florence, maybe even explore returning to architecture, designing something beautiful instead of just maintaining someone else's life. The list grew longer as the wine worked its magic, and by the time I went to bed in my new bedroom, I was smiling. Genuine happiness, not the careful performance I'd perfected as Richard's wife. Tomorrow, Richard and Jessica would return from paradise to discover exactly what I'd built while they were celebrating my replacement. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, in a beautiful place, answering to no one, with nothing but possibility stretching ahead of me. For the first time in 25 years, I fell asleep excited about what the morning might bring. I'd been in Tuscany for exactly 1 week when my old phone, the one I'd kept but silenced, finally rang with a call I answered. Not from Richard, but from Patricia. "Margaret," she said, her voice tight with barely contained amusement. "You need to hear this. Richard came to my office this morning." I was sitting on my terrace with morning coffee, watching the mist rise from the vineyards below. The call felt like an intrusion from another world, but I was curious despite myself. "Tell me," I said, settling back in my chair. He was. Patricia paused, searching for words. I've never seen a man so completely unhinged. He stormed into my office demanding to know where you were, threatening to sue me for participating in an illegal property sale. His face was this horrible red color, and he kept pacing around my office like a caged animal. I could picture it perfectly. Richard's carefully controlled facade cracking when he realized he'd lost control of the narrative. What did you tell him? The truth. That you're the legal owner of the property and had every right to sell it. That all paperwork was properly filed and the sale was completely legitimate. Patricia's voice took on a satisfied tone. He kept screaming about how I'd helped you steal his house, and I finally had to remind him that his name wasn't on the deed. You should have seen his face when that sank in. I sipped my coffee, feeling oddly detached from the drama unfolding back in Connecticut. Did he say anything about Jessica? A long pause. That's the interesting part. He came alone, and when I asked about his vacation, he got this look. Margaret, I don't think his romantic getaway went as planned. Of course it hadn't. I'd known women like Jessica my entire life. Ambitious, calculating, always looking for the next opportunity. The moment she'd realized Richard wasn't the wealthy, powerful man she'd thought she was seducing, she would have started planning her exit strategy. He demanded your contact information, Patricia continued. When I refused, he threatened to have me investigated for ethics violations. I told him to call the police if he thought a crime had been committed. He stormed out, but not before telling me this wasn't over. After Patricia hung up, I turned off the phone completely. Whatever Richard was planning, whatever legal threats he was making, none of it could touch me here. I'd covered every detail, consulted with lawyers who specialized in asset protection, and made sure every action I'd taken was completely within my rights. But Richard's anger wasn't really about the legality of what I'd done. It was about the complete destruction of his carefully constructed world. For 25 years, he'd controlled every aspect of our marriage, from finances to social scheduling to how I presented myself in public. He'd trained me so thoroughly to seek his approval that he'd forgotten I'd ever been capable of independent thought. 3 days later, my Italian phone, a new number only Francesca and my banker knew, rang at 8 in the morning. The caller ID showed an international number I didn't recognize. Margaret. Richard's voice was hoarse, stripped of its usual commanding tone. We need to talk. I should have hung up immediately. But there was something in his voice I'd never heard before. Genuine desperation. And I found myself curious about what version of Richard would emerge when his charm and control were stripped away. How did you get this number? I asked calmly. I hired a private investigator. Margaret, what you've done. This is insane. You've destroyed our entire life over a simple misunderstanding. A simple misunderstanding. Even now, even facing the complete collapse of his world, Richard was rewriting history to cast himself as the victim. Is that what you're calling it? Look, maybe I handled the vacation thing poorly. Maybe I should have discussed it with you first. But selling our house? Emptying our accounts? This is vindictive and cruel, and it's not like you. Not like me. He was right about that. The woman he'd trained to absorb his criticism and accommodate his selfishness would never have fought back this way. But that woman was gone, and in her place was someone he'd never bothered to know. Where's Jessica? I asked. The silence stretched so long I thought he might have hung up. Finally, he spoke, and his voice was flat. She left. The day we got back and found everything. She said she couldn't be with someone who'd let his wife destroy him like this. I almost laughed. Jessica had revealed her true nature exactly as I'd predicted. The moment Richard stopped being a powerful, wealthy man with something to offer, she'd disappeared. All his romance with her had been based on a version of himself that no longer existed. Richard, I said gently, you need to understand something. This isn't about Jessica. This isn't about the vacation or any single thing you did. This is about 25 years of being treated like an employee in my own marriage. That's not, he started, but I cut him off. You replaced me with a text message, like I was a restaurant reservation you needed to cancel. Do you have any idea what that felt like? Another long silence. When he spoke again, his voice was smaller, almost childlike. I know I hurt you. But Margaret, you have to come back. I can't. I don't know how to fix this without you. And there it was. Not an apology for how he'd treated me, not recognition of my worth as a person, but a practical plea for me to return and solve his problems. Even in his desperation, Richard couldn't see me as anything more than a resource to be managed. I'm not coming back, I said firmly, and I'm not going to help you clean up the mess you made. But what am I supposed to do? The question came out as almost a wail. The house is gone, the accounts are empty, my colleagues are asking questions. Everyone knows something happened, and I look like a fool who couldn't control his own wife. Control his own wife. Even now, that's how he saw our marriage. Not as a partnership that had failed, but as a control system that had malfunctioned. You'll figure it out, I said. You're a smart man, Richard. You managed to convince me for 25 years that I was lucky to have you. I'm sure you can convince someone else. Margaret, please. I know I made mistakes, but... Goodbye, Richard. I hung up and immediately blocked the number. Then I turned off the phone and walked out onto my terrace, where the morning sun was burning off the last of the mist. I felt no satisfaction in Richard's obvious misery, no triumph in his desperate pleading. What I felt was something more profound. Complete indifference to his problems. For the first time in my adult life, Richard's emotional state was not my responsibility to manage. That afternoon, I walked into the village of Montalcino and enrolled in an Italian language class. The instructor, a patient woman named Elena, smiled when I explained I was planning an extended stay. Tuscany is good for healing, she said in careful English. Many people come here to find themselves again. Over the following days, I established a routine that belonged entirely to me. Morning coffee on the terrace while reading Italian newspapers with a dictionary beside me. Language lessons 3 afternoons a week. Long walks through the vineyards where I photographed the changing light on the landscape. Cooking classes with a local chef who taught me to make pasta by hand and select the perfect wine for each dish. For the first time in decades, my days were my own. No schedule to coordinate around Richard's needs, no social obligations to fulfill for his career, no careful monitoring of his moods to determine whether I could share my own thoughts and feelings. 2 weeks after Richard's phone call, I received a package forwarded from my old address. Inside was a legal document, divorce papers, along with a letter from Richard's attorney demanding the return of marital assets and threatening legal action if I didn't respond within 30 days. I took the papers to a cafe in the village square and read them over a glass of Brunello di Montalcino. Richard was claiming that I'd stolen community property and demanding half of everything I'd taken, including my inheritance from my father. His lawyer had crafted a narrative where I was a vindictive wife who'd destroyed the family finances in a fit of spite. The irony was perfect. Richard, who'd spent our entire marriage controlling our finances and treating me like a dependent, was now claiming that money I'd inherited from my own father somehow belonged to him. Money he hadn't even known I possessed until I used it to escape him. I folded the papers and put them in my purse. Tomorrow, I'd call the lawyer I'd retained before leaving Connecticut and let her handle Richard's threats. Tonight, I had dinner plans with Elena and her husband Marco, who'd invited me to their family's Sunday meal. As I walked back to my villa through the golden evening light, I realized something remarkable had happened. Richard's desperate phone call, his legal threats, even the knowledge that our divorce would probably be messy and expensive, none of it had the power to upset me anymore. I'd spent 25 years walking on eggshells around his emotions, managing his reactions, living in fear of his disapproval. Now, even his rage couldn't touch the peace I'd found in this simple life I was building for myself. Richard could keep his anger, his lawsuits, and his need to blame me for the consequences of his own choices. I had something infinitely more valuable, The freedom to discover who I really was when no one was watching, judging, or trying to control me. And that freedom, I was learning, was worth every penny it had cost me to buy it. 8 months later, I barely recognized the woman I'd been when I'd first stepped off that plane in Florence. The Margaret who'd folded shirts with trembling hands while reading her husband's cruel text message felt like a character from someone else's story. I was standing in my kitchen, my permanent kitchen now, having purchased a small villa in Montalcino after falling in love with the peaceful rhythm of village life, when my Italian phone rang. The caller ID showed my American lawyer's office number. "Margaret," Sarah's voice was crisp and satisfied. "I have news about the divorce settlement. Are you sitting down?" I leaned against the stone counter I'd chosen myself, in the home I'd bought with my own money, surrounded by pottery I'd learned to make in the local artisan workshops. "I'm ready." Richard's attorney called this morning. They're withdrawing all financial claims and accepting the terms we proposed. No alimony, no asset division, clean break. He'll pay his own legal fees. I smiled, remembering the elaborate financial demands Richard had made initially. He'd wanted half of everything, including my inheritance, claiming I'd stolen marital assets. His lawyer had painted a picture of a vindictive wife who destroyed the family finances in a fit of jealousy. "What changed his mind?" I asked. Sarah laughed. "Your private investigator's report arrived yesterday. Apparently, Richard's been quite busy since you left. 3 different women in 8 months, including his current girlfriend who's been posting photos of herself in your old jewelry on social media. His law firm is also investigating some irregularities in his client trust account that date back several years." The jewelry stung a little. I'd left those pieces behind because they felt like symbols of transaction rather than love. But seeing them on another woman would still hurt. But the trust account issues didn't surprise me at all. Richard had always been careless about boundaries when they inconvenient him. "The best part," Sarah continued, "is that Jessica, remember the secretary? She's threatening to sue him for sexual harassment. Claims he promised to leave his wife for her and that she only went to the Maldives because she felt pressured to maintain the relationship or lose her job." I set down my coffee cup, genuinely shocked. "Is she serious?" "Dead serious. Apparently, after you disappeared and Richard's world fell apart, Jessica realized she could spin their affair as workplace coercion. Smart girl, actually. She's positioned herself as another victim of Richard's manipulation instead of the other woman who helped break up a marriage." The irony was breathtaking. Richard, who'd discarded me so casually, was now facing the consequences of his pattern with women. Jessica wasn't the naive victim she was claiming to be, but she was right about one thing. Richard had used his position of power to pursue her, just as he'd used his position as husband to diminish me. "So, he wants this divorce finished quickly and quietly," I said. "Very quietly. His reputation is hanging by a thread, and the last thing he needs is a messy court battle where more details about his personal life become public record." After I hung up with Sarah, I walked out onto my terrace and looked across the valley I'd come to think of as home. In the distance, I could see the vineyard where I'd started working part-time, helping with the harvest and learning about wine production. Next week, I was starting my new job as a consultant for a firm that specialized in sustainable architecture for historical renovations. My Italian had progressed from halting tourist phrases to genuine conversation. I had friends here, real friends who knew nothing about my old life except that I'd come to Tuscany to start over. Elena and Marco treated me like family, including me in their Sunday dinners and local festivals. Francesca, my former rental agent, had become a close friend who'd helped me navigate buying property and establishing residency. Most importantly, I'd rediscovered the woman I'd been before marriage. The architect who could look at a crumbling farmhouse and see its potential. The woman who could spend hours sketching design ideas or lose herself in the physical work of renovating her own home. The person who could sit in comfortable silence without feeling like she needed to entertain or accommodate anyone else. My phone rang again. This time, It was an international number I didn't recognize, but something made me answer. Margaret? The voice was tentative, uncertain. Richard's voice, but stripped of all its old authority. Richard. I kept my voice neutral. Congratulations on the new girlfriend. I heard she's posting photos in my old jewelry. A long pause. Margaret, I called to apologize. Really apologize. Not because my lawyer told me to or because I want something. Because I finally understand what I did to you. I sat down in the chair where I spent my mornings reading, looking out over the olive groves that had become as familiar as my own heartbeat. What brought this on? Therapy, he said, and his voice was different somehow. Smaller, but also more real than I'd heard it in years. Court-mandated, actually. Part of the settlement with Jessica. But the therapist. She made me look at patterns in my behavior that I'd never wanted to see. I waited, curious despite myself. I treated you like an employee, he said slowly, as if the words were difficult. For 25 years, I treated the woman I married like she was staff. I criticized you, controlled you, dismissed your thoughts and feelings. I made you smaller so I could feel bigger. The admission was so unexpected, so unlike the Richard I'd known, that I felt tears prick my eyes. Not tears of sadness or forgiveness, but tears for the woman I'd been who'd needed to hear those words for so long. And then, he continued, when you finally stopped accepting that treatment, I told myself you were the problem, that you were vindictive and cruel instead of just done. Yes, I said simply. I was done. I know I have no right to ask this, but are you happy? Really happy? I looked around my terrace, at the herbs I was growing in terracotta pots, at the easel where I'd started painting again for the first time since college, at the table where I'd eaten breakfast alone for 8 months without feeling lonely once. I'm more than happy, I told him. I'm free. I'm glad, he said, and he sounded like he meant it. I destroyed the best thing in my life because I was too stupid and selfish to recognize what I had. You weren't stupid, Richard. You were exactly who you chose to be. Another long silence. Finally, he said, Will you ever forgive me? I considered the question seriously. Forgiveness wasn't about Richard deserving it or earning it. It was about me choosing to release the last ties that bound me to our shared past. I forgive you, I said. But I don't want to rebuild any kind of relationship with you. This conversation is closure, not a beginning. I understand. His voice was thick with emotion. Margaret? For what it's worth, leaving you was the biggest mistake of my life. No, I said gently. Leaving me was the best thing you ever did for me. After I hung up, I sat on my terrace as the sun set behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose that I'd learned to capture in watercolor. Richard's apology had been genuine, I believed, but it didn't change anything fundamental about my new life. I'd needed to escape him to discover that I didn't need anyone's approval to be worthy of love and respect. I'd needed to lose the life we'd built together to realize that it had never really been my life at all. It had been a performance I'd given for an audience of one who'd never appreciated it anyway. The next morning, I drove to Florence to meet with my new business partner, an Italian architect who specialized in sustainable restoration. We were proposing to transform a 15th-century monastery into a retreat center for artists, preserving the historical integrity while making it fully accessible and environmentally sustainable. As I spread our plans across the conference table, explaining my vision for integrating modern conveniences with medieval stonework, I felt the deep satisfaction of using my talents for something meaningful, not managing someone else's life or smoothing someone else's path, but creating something beautiful that would outlast us all. That evening, I called my lawyer one final time. Sarah, when the divorce papers are finalized, I want you to send me a copy, not for my files, but because I want to frame the signature page. She laughed. That's the first time I've heard that request. It's not about celebrating the end of my marriage, I explained. It's about celebrating the beginning of everything that came after. As I hung up and began preparing dinner in my own kitchen, in my own home, in my own life, I realized that Richard had been wrong about one thing in his text message all those months ago. Jessica hadn't deserved that vacation more than me. I'd deserved this life, this freedom, this peace, this joy in simple daily pleasures that belonged entirely to me. I'd deserved to discover that I was enough, all by myself, without anyone else's validation or approval. And now, finally, beautifully, completely, I had it. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.